for first off, I don't know if anybody was able to make it to our SCMS panel, which is where Rosanne and I have been exchanging emails, but where we actually met was at our SCMS panel, which was really interesting group, and her presentation was amazing. So I'm super excited to hear what she has to say today about Stars Born. Dr. Welch serves as executive director of Stevens College MFA in TV and screenwriting. And she created a set of history of screenwriting courses because, as she says, history of film becomes history of the directors, AKA history of great men. She also teaches courses in 1 hour drama. Her TV writing credits include Beverly Hills 90210, Picket Fences, ABC News Nightline, and Touched by an Angel. She also edited When Women Wrote Hollywood, and which was named runner-up for the Susan Koppelman Award by the Popular Culture Association, and co-edited Women in American History, and also wrote Why the Monkeys Matter. So, and other amazing things, but I'm just gonna stop there so I can have her speak. So Rosanne, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, I am going to just jump right in by showing the screen, because that's the fun part, and I want to make sure I get through all the cool things we can say about A Star is Born in one class. So I'm going to sort of plow through this thing and then talk. So we'll have some time at the end. I know we're only here till 1 p.m., so that's perfect. So I'm going to get started.
If you run a little bit late, that's fine. We're here later, but I know you might have to go because you said you had 2 other things this afternoon. So
right, exactly. I have a 1 o'clock meeting to get to, but we'll make it happen. Yay, hello. So here we are. We're talking about the importance of female creatives in A Star is Born. For me, that's really what it's all about. I like to begin my lectures about the fact that I would like to acknowledge that this event is happening on the traditional lands of the Tongva people. That's what Los Angeles is. And we should recognize that there were people here before us, and we need to respect their history, and they're the people who still exist on this land. So I like to start with that. I learned that when I went to a conference in New Zealand, and they start all their lectures that way, and I thought that was quite beautiful. As you just said, so I don't need this. These are the shows that I've worked on. These are the books that I have written. The lecture we're speaking on today is going to come up next year in a book. I also am on the editorial board for Written by Magazine, which I happen to have a copy of right next to me. It's free online. So a magazine of the Writers Guild. I recommend people read it. It always has interviews with movie writers or television writers, and it's really good. I also do book reviews for the Journal of Screenwriting. It's a great place for new academics to get published. If there are books you feel like reviewing or you'd like a free copy of, you can write a review for me. So Vicki will get you in touch with me if that's interesting to you. As she just said, I work at Stevens College. Teaching philosophy, words matter, writers matter, women writers matter, and they've been far too often forgotten in history. So I love this movie to talk about because we're going to talk about a very important female writer in Hollywood. And yes, this is coming out of practice for a chapter that I'm creating on this book, on this movie, and how it really relies on the female input to make it work in each of the iterations. And we will see all of those women in all of those iterations. And as Jacob mentioned, we'll notice the last movie is the only one without a female creative in the writing team, which is interesting. Anyway, Toll begins with Adela Rogers St. John's. She was a journalist out of San Francisco. She moved to Hollywood and she began to write short stories and sometimes scripts. She wrote mostly prose stories that were transformed into films, one of which is a thing called What Price Hollywood. And it starred Constance Bennett, who was a very, very high-end female performer at the time. And it's a really interesting piece, but it is not the first Star is Born. There are parts of it that are similar, and we will see the parts that change. She's quite a fascinating person. If you ever want to read about her, she wrote a couple of memoirs, and she used to appear on television shows. You can find her interviews on YouTube. She's quite cool. She lived for a long time, and she was the mother confessor to the stars of Hollywood because she wrote for the Hearst Syndicate. And so people in scandals would call her and say, you've got to come to my house and tell me how to deal with the press because they're going to kill me because someone just died in my house, right? So she's a pretty cool lady. Jane Murfin also wrote on this original What Price Hollywood. Jane Murfin had a long screenwriting career. You don't hear a lot about her. I love this picture. Strongheart was her own personal dog. She also is the woman who invented the dog movie. Before Rin Tin Tin and Lassie, there was Strongheart. Believe it or not, the franchise of Strongheart created dog food, which was available up to about 10 years ago, even though obviously the dog and she are long gone. So 2 women wrote on that piece. In a nutshell, what is What Price Hollywood? It's an ambitious actress, a drunken director who she doesn't marry, She marries a polo player, a very famous man who's jealous of her fame. Her friend, the director, commits suicide, and she travels to Paris and reconnects with the husband who left her because he was jealous. Kind of the bones of Stars Born, but not exactly, right? So when we come along and redo it, it's going to be this team that is assigned to, can you do this differently? Can you do this better? Dorothy Parker, who I adore, her husband, Alan Campbell, who no one has probably ever heard of, and that's maybe fair, maybe not. He was an actor on Broadway when he met her, and they got married. He was her second husband. He wanted to come to Hollywood and be a writer. She did not. She was, as was mentioned earlier, a member of the Algonquin Round Table. She wrote witty things for the New Yorker. She did not want to live in Hollywood, but she did what her husband wanted because she wanted him to be happy. These other gentlemen, Carson and William, they came along. They've done some polishes, some pieces, but I'm going to maintain that the voice of The Star is Born, and that carries across almost all four of the iterations, is Dorothy Parker's voice. And to me, that's what's interesting, a screenwriter's voice. I like this. It's hard for you to read, but it's literally in an archive, the front cover of the first script. And I do love to remember that it all started on the page. It is something that was written first. And so amazing that these folks touched this, and we can go look at it at the Herrick Library. These are the credits on this 1937 Star is Born that you just watched. So you notice that the major screenplay credits are up here. Then we have from a story by. So Wellman and Carson wrote the basic story. These guys translated it into a screenplay, right? And then because IMDb tries to resurrect people who worked on things but weren't credited at the time, you see all these names in here. It is in Ben Hecht's autobiography. He claims to have written the final line, "I am Mrs. Norman Maine." Did he? Did he not? There's no paper trail for that, right? And he was known to be kind of an arrogant guy, and he liked to take credit for a lot of things. But he's on the list. We should pay attention. So that's writing credits. But I will say that it was her voice that did it. And this, in fact, is one of the quotes that makes me, gives me evidence for that. Somerset Maugham, a very, very famous writer in his own time, a novelist, so much better than a movie writer, much more literate and important. And he recognized right away she had this gift for finding something to laugh at in the bitterest tragedies of the human animal. And that is exactly what this story is, the bitterest tragedy of life, that someone you love cannot deal with the fact that you are having more success or luck in life than they are. And that is the saddest thing, or one of the saddest experiences that they could imagine. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind when we think about her voice and how it appears in this particular piece. I love her, as we said, her wittiness is there. She was talking about a time when the Motion Picture Academy was trying to create a union for writers. And this is what she had to say about having them watch, was like trying to get laid in your mother's house. Somebody was always in the parlor watching. And you couldn't trust them, obviously. So this wit and this sadness, I think very interestingly, connects inside this story. Also has been said about her, her stories feature female characters trying to square exhilarating new choices with the enduring, bold constraints of social expectation. The social expectation in A Star is Born is that a man should be more successful than his wife. That is something that happened in any particular level of the society at the time. Also, her heroines are lovelorn, and there are always suicidal alcoholics in so many of her pieces. And this appears in other films she wrote without Alan. They did eventually split up and get divorced. So she wrote for Hitchcock. He specifically sought her out. He wanted a writer as famous as she. And she got an Oscar nomination both for Star is Born and for Smash Up, The Story of a Woman, which was about a female alcoholic. So clearly these are all pieces of her little ingredient book that she threw together into A Star is Born. In a nutshell, what do we see in the first version of Star is Born? We have this ambitious actress. We have a drunken actor, not a director. They do marry, and he is jealous of her, despite how bad that makes him feel. We have this classic scene where she wins an Academy Award, and he shows up drunk and destroys and humiliates the evening, right? We have this classic line, "Can I have one more look at you?" Right? Before I kill myself, but you don't know that's what I'm about to do, right? We have the husband committing suicide off screen. We're going to see him walk off into the ocean. We're not going to see him dead on our screen. And of course, we're going to have this ending where she defends him to the society that destroyed him, to Hollywood, by saying, "I am Mrs. Norman Maine." And there's a lot, we'll talk about this in a little if we have some time. There's some argument. My undergrad students nowadays will say they hate that line. And they're seeing it as her stepping back and losing her identity. And I don't think that's how it was intended. I think if we think again about the time period, this was her asserting, this man meant something and you people ruined him and I will not forget him, right? So it's an interesting line to see. Everything changes as we move through society and we bring our own baggage to what we watch. So we have to think about that. It was intended to be a monument to him and not a detriment to her at this point. Okay, here's where I find Dorothy Parker's female focus coming to us. It begins with this grandmother, a female character, has the money to give her granddaughter what she needs to follow her dream. That's a big deal. Thinking that a woman in that period, who was now some 50 years older than the woman starring in the film, could have agency and could choose to give the money and trust her granddaughter when her own parents are not trusting her. I think that relationship is so key. That maternal relationship is a very big deal. Dorothy Parker's mother died when she was quite young. I think she was 9 or 10. She didn't like her stepmother, but she liked her grandmother. So clearly that's represented in this piece. Also, even though Esther seems a little weak and fluffy at some points, she certainly stands up for herself when she needs to, right? In this, we see Norman is a very desperate and envious guy. Some of what we read about Alan Campbell, he was desperate to succeed. He was desperate to be famous after they divorced and he couldn't get a job screenwriting. The producer literally said to him, look, get back together with the old lady. She's the one we want. Together we'll hire you. Imagine how humiliating that would be for someone, and not man or woman, but I want to be talented. I want to be recognized as someone of quality, but I can't be without attaching myself to this other person. Of course, she has a tons of acerbic wit. That's her thing. And in many ways, this is a Shakespearean tragedy, as all her poems are. So I think all of that speaks to her as the major writer behind this version of the film. The other guys came in, they did some stuff, but I don't see evidence of their lives on screen in the way that I see hers. Lines in this piece that she's written are so clearly things that could come out of her very own poems. And I love all of these. This is probably my favorite. His work was beginning to interfere with his drinking. She was always very blasé about alcoholism, and it's something that she suffered from herself. This is a great one when they put him in the asylum, for taking care of his drinking. They have iron bars in the windows to keep out the draft. I mean, how sarcastic and snotty can you be when you're trying not to admit you've been put in a place you can't sign your way out of until you clean up? And then the heartbreak comes out of this. For every dream of yours you make come true, you'll pay the price in heartbreak. So even if you're going to get what you want, you won't have everything. And that is kind of a message of her life, right? She never quite got everything that she dreamed of. I think you'll notice also in the lines here, this is a great bit. How's your luck? There wasn't any. Maybe you don't do it right. Take Danny McGuire. He knows the ropes, don't you? Yeah. Had him around my neck for years. She's always thinking about suicide, sadly. She's always thinking about ways to kill yourself. And this is best evidenced in this poem that she's famous for. I don't know if you've ever seen it before. You're probably reading it to yourself right now, so I shall not read it out loud. But it is quite brilliant. And look what she's focusing on. And that's her resume. Think about the title and think about the words there and how they come across inside A Star is Born. Now, 1937, huge movie. It wins awards. Everyone's paying attention. Janet Gaynor is a very important actress. So it's a big deal. 1954 comes around. There's a movie we can remake. And remember that in the era when they were remaking these films, there were no DVDs. There was no streaming. The film was done after it played in a theater for 2 weeks or 10 weeks, however successful it was. You would never see that film again. 1954, there's no TV reruns of that film. That's it. If your mother saw it in 37, that's it. Nobody has seen it since then. So remaking a movie made some sense. So we're going to come into this with a guy named Moss Hart, who's a very famous Broadway playwright. He worked with George S. Kaufman, but he also worked on his own. And he is invited to come and redo this for Judy Garland as the star. And it's going to be a comeback film. She's had trouble, oh no, with drugs and alcohol, and it's affected her career. So she needs a big vehicle. And this is recognized as a showpiece for a female performer. But she's Judy Garland. So we got to change something, all right? Where, first of all, let's look at these credits. One of the things I want to make point of, so here's Moss Hart. He takes full credit for the screenplay, but it is based on the one that Dorothy did with Alan and Robert, right? So this is how our credits read properly. What's interesting about this is He says when he's asked during his rewrites about some things he did not change at all. And he didn't for this very reason. He felt they were perfect the way they were. They were perfect the way she wrote them. He could not top those lines. So the 1954 version is still an echo and a mimic of Dorothy Parker, in my opinion, based on Moss Hart's confession, if you want to put it that way. And Moss Hart, if you've never read Act One, this is his autobiography of growing up poor in New York, working in some summer camps that are very much like Dirty Dancing summer camp, and eventually making it on Broadway. It's quite a good book if you're interested in that period. Of course, the joke is how much of it is true and how much did he elaborate on? We will never really know. There is then obviously a real biography of him if you are interested. But here's the man who's rewriting this version of Star is Born. So I will say, though it is written solely by a man, it is a man relying and reusing the words of a woman. So the female imprint is still highly there in this version. So let's look at what changed. First, we've got to move her into it being a musical star, because this is Judy Garland. She's going to have to sing musical numbers in this particular remake. We're still going to have our drunken actor, and they're going to marry, and he's going to be jealous. This is something that remains the same all the way until we get to Bradley Cooper, and we'll talk about why that changes. We're going to have our Academy Award moment, because musicals were things that earned Academy Awards back in the day, of course. He's going to commit suicide off screen. He's going to walk off into the ocean as the noble man that he is. And she too will introduce herself as Mrs. Norman Maine. So these things remain exactly the same. When the Writers Guild arbitrates a script to decide who should get final credit, they look at all versions of a script. They have a blind group of writers who sign up to do this. And they get the scripts, writer 1, writer 2, writer 3. You don't get any names. And then you decide statistically how much of a percentage of this person's original work made it to the end. And that's how they decide credit. So I am looking at this as if I'm arbitrating the various versions of this script to see how much credit Dorothy Parker still deserves. In this case, I think a lot, right? They're borrowing a lot of what she did. Now, 1976 comes along, and this is Barbra Streisand and Kris Kristofferson. So 54, we're jumping to 76. It's kind of like once every generation, there's an interest and a need for this movie, partially because female creatives, whether they be writers or actresses, see this as a great piece to work from and a great way to reflect on their moment in culture, right? So this is a big fancy deal. Look at these great photographs. Let me tell you, this is going to be written by Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn. They are a married couple who write their own novels, as you see here, and work out of New York. They get hired to do this, and Joan is going to have her own imprint on it. We're going to see that in a second. I also want to highlight the fact that John Gregory Dunn wrote this marvelous book, if you've never read it, called Monster, Living Life Off the Big Screen. It's about the writing of this film up close and personal, which was meant to be the story of Jessica Savage, an anchor woman who died when she was high on cocaine and drove her car into a lake and drowned. And by the time they were done, it had nothing to do with her at all. And so this tells you the 8-year struggle to get the movie made out of the Disney company. It's really a good inside look at how writers and producers work with studios. Anyway, we bring in Joan and John. So in this third version, we're going to have another female writer with her imprint on this movie. She's going to change a few things. She is a journalist. She's worked in New York. She's worked out of Sacramento. She's covered the hippie generation. She particularly wrote this lovely book called The White Album, where she looked at culture of her day. And she studied the Doors. She was fascinated by the Doors and their popularity and the way that Jim Morrison just blew up in American culture, right? She, in fact, called them the missionaries of apocalyptic sex, right? Look at this beautiful picture of this young man, right? Sadly, he's going to be one of the guys who dies young, right? He's going to join that Jimi Hendrix and, that whole team of people that we've lost too young in life. But now Joan is writing this new version, and she's going to make the new people rock and roll stars. So we're going to move out of acting, move out of musical theater. We're going to move into the rock world. So right away, she's patterning things on Jim Morrison. Look at this picture of Kris Kristofferson. This is Kris Kristofferson young. This is Jim Morrison. Look how close they are. You could almost mix them up, right? So Joan immediately is having this vision of who is this new Norman Maine. And because Norman is not such a cool name in the 70s, he's John Norman Maine, right? So we're going to make a little change. A lot of chest in this movie. So really be thinking about how she was really like picturing Jim Morrison no matter what she does. So she brings a journalistic background to this. She brings feminism to this in a way that maybe it didn't appear as much, in that this is Barbra Streisand. Not only is she acting in this piece, she's producing it, right? She's the first woman producer on this movie. So she has final say. And one of the things she makes sure happens is when they get married, she does the proposing to her John Norman Maine. When they have their ceremony, there's a whole little piece of dialogue where she says, oh, it's got that obey part. Obey doesn't happen. She has a female minister marrying them. And Chris is in a white tux. Men usually wear black to their weddings, but if the girl has to wear white and pretend to be a virgin, why shouldn't the boy, right? So there's something visual here, right, that a woman has planned this scene. And one of the changes we'll bring to this Esther is that she's going to hyphenate her last name. She will be Esther Hoffman Howard, and that will be how she announces herself at the end. So we're getting some movement of the feminist world coming into this through Joan, and John himself also a feminist because he's married to a woman who is equally comfortable. Now they're bringing a marriage to it, right? But their marriage is happy all their life. They didn't have issues over whose novel made more money last year. So what's different in this one in a nutshell, right? We're going to go back to, she's ambitious, but she's a rock star. He's a rock idol. He's jealous. It's hard not to be jealous. We're going to add the component that they write a song together. That is one of the sexiest things you can watch human beings do. Come up with love words that you put to music and sing to each other and then kiss in the middle of singing. It's friggin' gorgeous. It's a sex scene without everybody getting naked, right? And this is what we can do in 1976. It simulates sex. We're not going to the Academy Awards. We're going to the Grammy Awards because that's what we do in rock and roll. We're still going to keep the line. So Dorothy Parker is still giving us with one more look at you. This is a huge deal. This time, it was decided that it was, I don't like the word cowardly, but it was weak to walk off into the ocean. It was far cooler and more dude-like, more testosterone-driven for him to get into this brilliantly beautiful, expensive car and crash up. And it's just a deeply sad scene. And then, of course, she gets called when she comes to the site and she's actually touching the dead body, right? And she's like, don't want to leave him, and her manager has to pull her off of him and all that stuff. So we've changed a few things, but we've not changed the trajectory of the story. And again, that's what an arbitrator would look at, right? An arbitrator would say, no, the plot points are still there. The decoration is what has changed. So pretty big deal. Just briefly, I wanted to cover the fact that, so 20 years later, Joan and John are going to write Up Close and Personal. It's about an ambitious female news reporter, her seasoned older male news reporter, who's at his peak, but he's Robert Redford, so he's not failing, but he's about to fail. He's hit the best of his career. They fall in love. They fight. Spoiler, he dies, not over trying to help her, but like his world is over and it's time for him to go. And then she goes on with that. It's the same friggin' basis, but I wouldn't say that it's a remake of Star is Born, right? There's not enough in there that makes it the same. So here's something that fascinates me. I remember reading this in the trades and how cool it would have been when they thought about the third remake. This is obviously some 15 years ago now. It was a natural for Whitney Houston. You want a famous female singer, you want this story, and she had just done The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner, which had her be a famous singer, right? And she has falls in love with her bodyguard in this case, et cetera, which also became a Broadway musical, believe it or not. And I'm gonna do a little tangent because I love to talk about writing. Why in the heck is Dolly Parton in my picture? She wrote a song called I Will Always Love You in the 50s when she quit her partnership with a male country singer. When they did The Bodyguard, they needed a song that would be the song where Whitney Houston's character kind of declared that she loved Kevin Costner. He's a country music fan. He said to her, I know this song that Dolly Parton wrote like 20 years ago. Could you reuse it? And she liked it. Whitney Houston said, yeah. And they went to Dolly Parton because they have to get rights to it because she wrote the song. And they were like, Dolly, once Whitney sings this will be in history, Whitney Houston's song. And Dolly, being a very smart businesswoman, said, yes, but the writer gets all royalties for the song. And I am perfectly happy for Whitney to own the performance. So it was a pretty brilliant move on her part. And I'm sure that you've all heard that song as a Whitney Houston song. So that came out of The Bodyguard. They were thinking about getting Denzel to be the actor / rock star / whatever they would need him to be in this version, or they were thinking about Eddie Murphy. Sadly, Whitney Houston died. So this version was never able to be made. And I think that's a big loss, because if we're going to remake a movie, you know, let's do new and different things. And she would have been brilliant. It would have been great. It didn't happen. So the idea lagged for a while. And then all of a sudden, the Lady Gaga version comes up, which I'm sure most of you have seen. Let's see similarities. She's not a rock star so much as she's a pop star. And that's because we have the dancers behind her and we're sort of working in a different world. He, more or less, though, is a rock idol because it's cooler for boys to do rock than pop, right? We giggle at Justin Bieber. We think rock stars are hot. So he maintains the rock business. But here's a change that Bradley Cooper, who's one of the writers on the movie, definitely made. His dude is not jealous of her. He is supportive and happy. His problem is that he's an addict and he can't break his addiction. It has nothing to do, he's an addict before he meets her. Her popularity does nothing, has no change to that. So I think that's an important difference. And we're going to talk about why that difference happens. Same thing, they're going to write a song together, a beautiful song. Again, that's a very sexy thing for them to do. At the Grammy Awards, he's going to embarrass her, but not out of anger that she's getting attention. And I've got a little slide I'm going to show you on that. We're going to use the "one more look at you" line. So Dorothy Parker is still hanging out, not only in the plot, but in these lines. This time, her guy, and they call him Jackson Maine because Norman is boring and so is John by the time we get to 2019. What we do is, he doesn't cheat on her. In the other ones, the woman finds the guy cheating because he finds another young girl that, you know, will make him feel better because his wife is better than he is. He does not do that. Bradley Cooper did not want his character to do that. Like Chris Christopherson, though, he will commit suicide essentially on screen. We're going to know what he's doing and it's not off, lose his body and nobody has to see him. She's going to see his body when they find him. And in the more modern world, if you want to call it that, she is just Allie, like Cher is Cher, right? And Beyonce is Beyonce. She is Allie. So at the end of the movie, she can't change her name, but she does in fact introduce herself as Allie Maine. So she establishes that last name repetition from the previous versions. Now, I tend to call this the Bradley Cooper version. And as Jacob asked me, do I like it? I like it to the extent that I like the bones of this story. But because a male wrote it and had two other male screenwriters rewrite him, it becomes his story. It becomes the Jackson Maine story. We have much more focus on his character, his backstory, and while giving a female superstar one name seems modern, in many ways, it erases part of her own history. What is her actual last name? Right? A female character without a last name is not one who's been thought through all the way, I would say, in reading a script. So in this case, we focus so much on his backstory, so much about his own family. It's his brother that's part of the story. So much is more about the star who's dying than the star who is being born in this movie. She doesn't really have the same agency, certainly not that Barbra Streisand gave her character, really not that we had out of Julie or Janet either. In this scene, and these are quotes from Bradley Cooper as he was making the film, he was being interviewed, right? He says he's on stage trying to support her, but his demons won't let him, right? So we still have the debacle, but it's not because he wants to ruin her night. He's trying to be there to support her, and then it's embarrassing and terrible and sad. And also, he says that at the end of the movie, she's just starting, right? And what she's going to create is going to be bigger than what we've seen prior. That means her movie isn't this movie, that her movie is the next one, which will never be made. That means this is the Jackson Maine story. And that's not what I signed up for. I signed up for the star, the female star being born. So I think that's a huge change that he, as a male writer, has brought to this franchise. You look at the writing credits, right? So if Bradley wrote it with this guy, Will Fetters. If you go to the Writers Guild, when you have time, when it's open again in the library, they have a copy of the first draft. And if you read it to compare to the film that you saw in 2019, you will be shocked because it is not brilliant. It is this guy who's an Academy Award winner for Forrest Gump, and I think he has 2 Academy Awards, Eric Roth, who came in to do the rewrite that really molded the piece. But he's taking the ideas that Bradley Cooper had, which are to focus more on Jackson Maine's character. They base themselves on the Moss Hart screenplay, right? So by the time we're done with this, Dorothy's name has finally disappeared entirely, even though all the bones of it are really still there and really still her, if you ask me. This is the only time they made separate posters and focused on them. Almost every movie iteration, you see them both together because it's a love story. That's what you're being told in that poster. I don't know what these posters are telling you, except do you know the title of the movie, then you'll understand. But I had several students who never knew it was a remake when they went to see it. So they had no idea. The title meant nothing to them. It's always the female that carries the story, right? This is this giant poster of Allie. That's what this is all about. All these women are the reasons these movies were made in the first place. That's what drew the box office. That's what drew the studios to support them. And every one of these is the story of a woman doing something new against the culture of her time, facing one of the various waves of feminism, right? If you think about 1937, women had had the vote for under 20 years. A bunch of women were still not voting because their husbands wouldn't let them, even though it was legal, right? In 54, we're 10 years after the end of the war, and the Rosie the Riveter and all that stuff, when women were told to go back home, put on your pearls and start vacuuming, right? Don't try to be in the man's world. That's your job. We get around to 76 and we're in the second wave of feminism. That's just 3 years after Roe versus Wade. And we're still doing the equal pay marches. We're still looking for equal pay. And if you get around to the current version, it's 10 years after the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which gave fair pay to people doing the same job. So each of these movies takes place in their female characters working truly in a world where there were still feminist issues going on, which I think is also part of what Dorothy started with. Think about how men feel today. I think men have changed. That's why they gave more attention to Bradley Cooper's character. There are 7 million men who are sort of stay-at-home dads. That's a huge thing. That's a huge difference. There are a lot more men getting used to the fact that their wives will have more money than they do, right? Colleges are like 60% women, 40% men, which means you're likely to be in a marriage where your wife will make more money than you. And your generation is likely to be more comfortable with that. I think that's a good thing. I think it's important to see that the female characters grow a little bit in every one of these iterations. The last two are more ethnic women. That wouldn't have happened before, right? Barbara is so clearly a Jewish woman and very proud of it. And Allie represents herself as a Sicilian American woman. Her father is a Sicilian guy who owns a bunch of limos. You know, he's a driver for a limo company. So it's very New York Sicilian kind of thing. In both cases, the women in these last two films, the female performers, wrote the songs they had their characters sing, and they both won Academy Awards for writing one of those songs, which is a huge deal, right? To me, again, making it more of a female franchise. Allie accepts more of the stuff that happened to Janet Gaynor. You know, look at me, check me out, make sure that, you know, I can change. I'll do anything you want to be successful. She accepts the dancers and things she doesn't need. And in this case, people feel like she was more on her own because she didn't say, I'm Mrs. anybody, but she took his name, which was, again, following that pattern of respecting him. So I think it's really important to remember them. I think it's important to remember what it could have been if we'd had a chance to see a Whitney Houston version. I think that would have been an incredible movie. I'm still bummed I'm never going to get to see it. And I think it'd really be cool if Dorothy had lived to see it all, but she didn't. She died in 1967. And I think it's interesting to point, why is Martin Luther King in this picture? People may or may not know that if you buy any of her writing, if you buy the portable Dorothy Parker, you will find that she gave all her money when she died to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. She did not know, of course, that he would die a year later, and all of his estate went to the NAACP. So if you buy any of her writing, you're supporting the NAACP. And that's because even as a young woman at the age of 27, she was reviewing Broadway plays. And she reviewed Emperor Jones. And she had this quote about how the producers in Broadway at that time, because there wasn't, you know, she wasn't involved in Hollywood, they were wasting the genius of the African-American community. Obviously, she's using word of the day, but she recognized the genius that was being lost. So she wanted to support the cause of civil rights, social justice and civil rights. And I think that's pretty cool. So I think she's a pretty cool lady all around. think it's cool to realize how much of an effect this movie has had on film history. If you are a diehard fan and you watch it for Christmas, even though it's not a Christmas movie, you'll notice the big moment at the end is that all through the movie, she's defined herself as Holly Gennaro, which is her maiden name because they're separated. But in the end, when they make up and she runs to the police and they say something about, are you so-and-so? She says, Holly McLean. She takes his name back. So she's doing exactly a homage to that moment. In the same way, some 20 years later, this is 1988, in Notting Hill, we finally have a guy who doesn't mind when they call him Mr. Scott, which is Anna Scott's name, right? That's not his last name, but he's now fine with a wife who is 5 million times more famous than he will ever be. So our society had come to this point, one assumes, in 1999. And Dorothy herself has been homaged and written about. Fitzgerald, who knew her personally, wrote about her in The Last Tycoon. She's one of the characters in there. She's in this Broadway play as a character. And if you like the Gilmore Girls at all, Amy Sherman Palladino's production company is called Dorothy Parker Drank Here. That's how popular she maintains in the modern world. I got a bunch of clips you could see at another time because we don't have time. I always like to offer up a bibliography because you should know there's a lot of stuff you could study. And that's it. That's everything I can say in a nutshell about